it occurred to me when you asked me to come on and talk about how to do a record label that, I mean, did you not read the book? It didn't turn out well in the end. It's got a double title, How to Run a Record Label, but also How to Ruin a Record Label. And sadly, it did end up in the dumpster, although it had a good run for a while there.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, though, like, the best kind of information is the kind that, like, hey, here's some things that I didn't do completely right. And most of the record label books, because I think I have almost every record label book out there. I've been collecting them for years, hoping to start a record label. And I've read most of them, and they're just boring, baloney garbage half the time, and a lot of stuff that's way out of date. But hearing about the real relationships and the struggles that you went through was really good.
Well, I think a lot of times when people write about record labels or bands for that matter, their agenda is primarily to, sort of bask in the glory of it all. Say, oh, this was so great. Too bad you weren't there. Too bad you missed out on it. But, we were so awesome. And then it ended, and that was the end of the scene. Too bad. But yeah, I sort of wrote in the last chapter of mine, I didn't want to do that. I wanted to write the whole story. I mean, as well as I could manage. And that meant turning a magnifying glass on myself as well. If something goes wrong, you can't just say, oh, well, it ran out of time, or so-and-so messed it all up. You have to look at yourself and say, well, maybe I did some right things, but I might have done some wrong things too. Let's look and see what they were, and if there's anything we can learn from it.
Mm-hmm. Very true, very true. So Joe from Don Giovanni on the book says, when Green Day and Nirvana were causing kids to start bands, labels like Lookout were inspiring them to start record labels. And from what I remember, I was probably in like 94. I was probably in like 5th, 6th grade, and I just started getting into music or whatever. But labels were kind of like a bad thing, kind of in an idea. But about that time when I started getting into punk rock, labels started becoming like a good thing for some crazy reason. And Lookout was one of the best ones, because you'd be like, hey, instead of saying like, when's this new band gonna come out, you'd be like, oh, what's new on this label or that label,
Yeah, I think your perception of labels as being a bad thing would probably at least partly have come from the fact that when you're just a kid just starting to get interested in music, your first exposure is mostly going to be to major labels. And so it's kind of like McDonald's. Even if you like their hamburgers, I don't think that many people have a real warm spot in their heart for the McDonald's Corporation, and are really fascinated about what the chairman of the board is having for lunch, and what him and his wife are doing. It's just not. It's a machine.
Mm-hmm.
And on top of that, and this goes back a lot further, but it was kind of cooked into the perception of the public, was, back in when rock and roll was young in the 1950s and early 60s, a lot of what the record companies did was just plain criminal. There's no nicer word to put about it. They would take unsophisticated performers, especially black performers, who at that time were laboring under a huge disadvantage because we still had institutionalized segregation in this country, and you couldn't even get a black performer couldn't even get played on the radio. So they would like sign deals with these performers and basically take all of the credit, all of the money, and even if they sold 1 million records, the poor guy would or lady would be like back out on the street the next day and not even know what happened. Oh, yeah, I was famous for a few weeks there, but I would, even an example, the Big Mama Thornton that wrote "You Ain't Nothing But a Hound Dog." I think she was probably still playing in bars long after Elvis made himself a international superstar singing the song that she wrote. That was quite common, and it didn't only happen to black performers. It happened to most white performers too, to naive ones at least, and most of them were naive, because that's one of the one of the things, one of the problems musicians run into regularly is that their attitude is, I don't want to think about business. If I wanted to think about business, I go to accounting school. I just want to play my music, man.
Yeah.
And the trouble is, dealing with the business is part of it. You can't really get away from it. But because of that sort of blinkered attitude, a whole lot of musicians just got treated really badly, got ripped off. And, the public had, with good reason, a very bad impression of the big bad music corporations and the talent scouts and the managers and the executives, because a lot of rip-offs happened, and a lot of musicians were naive. They just wanted to play their music and they didn't want to think about business. And as a result, a lot got taken advantage of, and it just kind of became this impression with the public that, oh, the musicians are cool, but the record companies are bad. And so, but, most people, their main interest is in, I want to hear the good music. So they didn't really think too much about it. When they went shopping, they didn't say, oh, I'm going to buy this record because it's on Warner Brothers, but I'm not going to buy this record because it's on Columbia. That might have happened sometimes, especially if they had a superstar performer on one label. They say, oh, well, it must be a good label. I'll try some of the other stuff. But that was rare. When the indie labels started coming along, and I think there's one other note I should make, is that at one time they were all indie labels. Mm-hmm. Even the giant corporations that we think of now as being the mega corporations and cyclopses and all of that, most of them started out with somebody pressing up a 1,000 records and selling them out of the trunk of his car, and it's just the ones that grew. They grew and they grew. By the time that people like myself were coming up, it was not that likely that a regular guy could or woman could do that anymore. It had become so built up and so structured. But one of the outgrowths of the punk scene and the whole DIY music movement was you could do things like that yourself. It was way underground. Mm-hmm. And if it hadn't been so underground, the big companies probably would have crushed us right from the start. They just didn't even notice since we were so far below the radar. There's another element that I think it's really vital to bring up, which something was started happening in the 60s and 70s, and really even more so in the 80s, is technology changed. That people began getting tools that allowed them to do things that before you could only have to pay a lot of money to an expert, a technician to do for you. Most people I know nowadays are too young to remember before Xerox machines, but that was the actual crucial thing. When I was a kid, there was no such thing. The only place that had anything where you could do mass printing was typically a school or a business would have a thing called I can't think of it, mimeograph. Yeah. And it was like a really elaborate machine full of stinky chemicals, and it only printed in blue ink. And no regular guy could afford to use one of those. So when I was in 7th grade in the 50s, I decided I wanted to start my own underground school newspaper, just a satire of the official one. I literally had to type it by hand on a manual typewriter with carbon paper, so I could make one original and 2 copies, and then I would pass them around. My print run was 3, but I would pass them from hand to hand around the school, and until the teacher or the principal caught up with it, confiscated it. That was how we had to operate, and obviously you're not going to get too big at that. When Xerox machines started coming along, suddenly anybody with an axe to grind or anybody with a passion to explore could start their own magazine or a newspaper, fanzine, whatever you want to call it. And that's one of the things that I did. And that's one of the main things that grew into Lookout Records. Lookout Magazine first, then Lookout Records. And it was also a lesson to me. When I first started thinking of having a record label, I thought, well, I've been doing this magazine for a few years, and it can be a pain, but at the same time, I went from 50 copies up to thousands of copies. Not sure why wouldn't records work the same way. There were reasons that they don't work exactly the same way, but the principle is similar. Mm-hmm. And at that time, you still had to go to a recording studio. That's something that's changed even more since then. Now you could make records better than we did in your living room with your computer. Another thing that changed at that time was if you wanted to put color art on the cover of your record, you had to pay somebody a couple $1,000s to do these elaborate photographic separations in the lab. A few years later, you could. I mean, that's why if you look at the early Lookout records, none of them are in full color until 1990, and that we had to pay an extra. We had to pay more money to get the cover prepared for printing than we did for the actual recording.
Oh wow!
But until then, you'll see some of our covers would have little bits of color, but that was done mechanically, where you just put a sheet over the original black and white with a different color. But if you wanted full color, it was like thousands of dollars, and then a couple years later, computers would just spit it out for virtually no extra charge. So things like that made it possible for basically anybody to be their own record label. And I remember in the 90s, right when we were starting to really hit our peak, and talking to somebody about the future. And of course, we had no idea exactly, but I said, I think in the future, it's probably, records and CDs and cassettes are probably all going to be just, novelties or disappear into history. Music will probably be on some kind of microchip or something. And it was around that time that if you look at record label contracts, whether major or indie, they would start to, used to be, they would say, we get the rights to any records, and then they would add cassettes and they had compact discs. But around somewhere in the 90s, you started at, or any other technical means that should become known anywhere in the universe.
Yeah, the known universe clause. So that's awesome. So,
ironically, of course, some of this technology would end up upending the whole business, and now you're in a situation where much of what would have worked 10, 20, 30 years ago is kind of useless.
Yeah.
And unless you just want to run a boutique label where, well, actually, I want to say something about that because, and I think I mentioned it in the book too. There are people who do really fine labels, and I wish I could come up with a name or two, but I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with it, where they do limited run presses, they do beautiful colored vinyl, they do exquisite covers and art, and they'll often pick out a band that's kind of a cult favorite, and they'll press a couple thousand and sell them all at a fairly high price, and everybody's happy because people, they created a beautiful product, and people can put it on display in their living room, and may or may not ever actually play the record, but it's just a beautiful piece of art to have. But that's a very different philosophy to why I got into the music business. In fact, I didn't think I was getting into the music business. I thought I was just getting into music. I didn't realize it would turn into such a business. But my attitude was quite different. I didn't really care what color the vinyl was on, if I had to hand leather the cover myself. My point was to make the music available to as many people as possible, in as reasonable and economical a way as possible. Mm-hmm. I didn't have any kind of pre-imposed limit. It wasn't like, I'm just going to do 1,000 copies or 500 copies or 1,000, 10,000. But that was never my idea. My idea was to create a structure where I would be able to produce as many records or cassettes or later CDs as people wanted, whether that be a few hundred or a few million. And it was not like I said, it was not a plan to become big in the music business. It was a plan to reach, or to enable music to reach people that wouldn't otherwise hear it. Like what was going on in the East Bay of San Francisco and in Berkeley in 1987 was really magical and very special to those of us who were there. But it was literally a couple hundred of us. There were probably most people, even in the city of Berkeley itself, even people that lived down the block from Gilman Street, the majority of them probably never heard of us because we weren't in local papers, we weren't on the radio. To those of us who were regulars at Gilman, the music and the culture and the life that surrounded it was everything. It was just like, all encompassing. It just was like we were constantly going around like, I can't believe this is happening. This is so amazing that we're part of this. But nobody else knew. And if we hadn't figured out a way to get that music and that art and those ideas out to a wider public, eventually it would have faded. A couple of years, 2, 3, 4 years, it probably would have faded away. And maybe someday somebody would have wrote a book or done a magazine article on it. Like, oh, there was this cool little scene in Berkeley and then it disappeared. But instead, we were able to reach millions of people. And
I always thought it was kind of crazy that like I lived outside Chicago, so it was close enough to whenever someone asks, I'm like, oh, I'm from outside Chicago. But like it was technically Indiana in a town called Boone Grove. So it was like farmy town, whatever. And in high school, coming into this and having like a group of people that were into this kind of music and seeing the records coming from the East Bay, like before the internet really hit. How did that all happen? Because that blows my mind to this day. Like, how did we get these records from that little area over there that just blew up?
Well, I often, I'm sure I'm not the only one who wonders about that sometimes. How did we even live before the internet? How did anything happen? There's a guy called Tom Jennings who was a regular. He also founded the magazine Homo Core. But he was a regular at Gilman in the early years. And one day he told me, oh, yeah, we got this experiment going on where we're trying to teach computers to talk to each other. And I was like, what would they even say? But that was the early form of the internet. That was actually before Gilman. That was 1985. And by about 1993, 94, we were on the internet, but we had already built up our kind of connections by, we used to have to mail everything, I give an example. Around early 90s, we had done the first Screeching Weasel record, which is from out your way in Chicago. And they had to drive out to California and record it and then went through the mixing and mastering and all. But for their second one, Ben, the leader of the band, did not want to come out to California, and he didn't want to come into the mixing room or any of that. He wanted to just hand it over to other people. So it turned into this ridiculous process that lasted probably the better part of a year, where the studio engineer in Indiana would mix it, and then he would send a cassette to Ben in Chicago by mail. And then Ben would send a cassette to me out in California and with a notes or phone conversations about what was wrong with it and what needed to be fixed. And then I would have to explain to the engineer back in Indiana about what needed to be done. And then the whole process would repeat multiple times. And as you know, mailing a cassette from one side of the country to the other, you're looking at like 3 days each time. And then trying to explain either by letter, which also takes a few days, or a phone call, what exactly, how to fix the guitars or whatever the so-called problem was. Contrast that to a couple of years ago, I put together a record for some people, and I never left my room. I mean, the whole thing was done on the computer. I would say to this band out in Colorado, can you send me a song? And the next few days later, here comes a song, fully mixed and everything. And just like that, I mean, I accumulated songs from 12 different bands, and 16, I think. But I was just, it was just done like that. And, similarly, Don Giovanni just re-released a bunch of stuff by my old band. Again, never had to leave my room or leave my computer. So, some people say, oh, yeah, well, that's not as romantic as piling everybody into a van and driving across the country and sleeping on floors and eating beans and all, which may be true in some ways. But it also, it's an indication of how much things have changed. And it's also why I would caution anybody that's coming to me for advice about how to start a record label nowadays. I probably don't really have that much advice that is relevant. I can tell you how it was done at one time. I'm not sure that I could tell you. Well, I can tell you maybe some general principles, but certainly not the basic technology of it. I know that people are still putting out records, and I know that some people are still selling a lot of records and making a lot of money. Although when I say records, I don't mean vinyl records or whatever. I mean creating songs and putting them out to the public. I don't think I haven't seen Taylor Swift at lining up at the Poorhouse anytime lately. And she, there are many performers who are doing as well as ever, but this is not an area of expertise for me. I think the people who will suffer are the ones who think, oh yeah, well, vinyl's going to come back and save the day, or I'm going to do a cassette only label because that's like keeping it cool and underground. Yeah, well, that's fun, and that's a nice hobby, and it might even be a nice little enterprise, but that's basically when you're focusing on the object, the artifact, not the music. Because basically, I know vinyl has made a big comeback compared to when it was almost dead at the end of the 90s, but it's still just this tiny fraction. I mean, the vast majority of people under the age of 40 or 50 may never even seen a record player, let alone know how to operate one. And I don't think that's going to change any more than, people are going to go back to the kind of put your finger in the dial and dial the telephones, and they weigh about 20 pounds that we used to have when I was a kid, or the ones that were even that my parents had where you had to turn a crank and call the operator to make a phone call. It's just probably not going to happen, even though they're kind of cool to look at. So, people are mad about the whole streaming thing and the digital audio thing, but I don't think getting mad is going to help anybody. Unless you just want something to go on a crusade about and maybe get on the internet and rant and rave about it. But
when you started, you just did 7 inches. And then you moved on eventually to CDs and whatnot, because that became a newer thing, right?
When we started, we did 7 inches, and some people said, and when we started doing our first 12 inches, some people said, oh, look out, selling out, going corporate, going commercial. But there was never anything, religious or spiritual or sacred about the 7-inch record that we had committed ourselves to. We did 7 inches at the beginning because that's what we could afford to do. It was the only thing available to us. I remember this is kind of a comparison, but I don't know how familiar you are with the whole garage band kind of scene, where people try to play in this really rough, ragged style that sounds really cheaply recorded, even if they have the money to pay for really good recording. They deliberately make it sound like as if it was like recorded in a basement someplace through tin cans. And similarly, they will buy these instruments that were popular back in the 1960s. There's a guitar called the Silvertone, for example. When I was a teenager, that was basically what everybody that wanted to play in a band got, was a Silvertone guitar from Sears Roebuck, which I don't know how many of your listeners will even remember Sears Roebuck, but they were a big shop, big department store at that time. it was a cheap, junky guitar, but it was what people could afford, especially where I lived in, a working class neighborhood. And similarly, the kinds of amps and stuff, they made a really distorted kind of crappy sound. And then 30, 40 years later, you got these young musicians like, I want to sound like those cool bands back in the 60s. So I'm going to get really shitty equipment and pay a fortune for it. Those silver tone guitars probably cost 10 times now what they cost back then. Sure. And we used to make fun of kids for playing silver, even if we didn't have a guitar of our own. We'd make fun of, you got yourself a Sears Roebuck guitar, did you? Ha, ha, ha. So they kind of missed the whole point. People made cheap sounding records because that's all they could afford to make, and that's all they had the technology to make. And that was basically the same with our early 7-inches. And they also sounded really cheap because we were recording on 8-track recording studios for, what seemed like a fortune to us at the time. We literally had a couple of hours that we could afford to get the band in and out of the studio. So there wasn't a whole lot of messing around. Like, can we retake that and remix the overdubs and all? No, that stuff was not happening. But, the first few 7-inches did well. And so we were very fortunate enough to be able to do some 12 inches. If we had not been able to start doing 12 inches, that would have been the end of us. We would have made a few more 7 inches and then gone out of business because it's extremely hard to make much of a profit at all on 7 inches. You make 1,000 of them and sell them all. Then, you got your money back and a little bit left over. And by the time you give something to the band, and that whole time, unless you've got another sort of day job, you're basically right back where you started. The 12 inches did in those days make a substantial profit, and that's what enabled us to start growing and eventually started doing cassettes at I think about 88 or 89. We started doing cassettes because that was the new thing, and then CDs about 1990. Of course, that really unleashed a firestorm among the punk community because CDs were supposedly the work of Satan. Even a lot of mainstream industry people did not like them. Ironic thing was that before long they were cheaper to make than records, and could hold twice as much money. Twice as much music. But I Freudian slip there because the whole money thing was one of the reasons the punks hated the CDs was that the record companies were repressing CDs of all of the old vinyl records from the earlier years and then charging twice as much for them. Yeah. So, the Rolling Stones or Bob Dylan record you could have bought for $4 or $5 a few years ago suddenly was on CD for $10 or $15. And so the punks, there was a lot of pressure to but the CD will hold 73 minutes of music, so you got to fill it all up or else you're ripping off the public. And that was a expensive and probably artistic mistake that I made. I felt guilty just putting a regular 12-inch length record onto a CD, so I would always insist that there be extra tracks. And I can give you at least 2 examples of both with Green Day and with Operation Ivy, which were our 2 biggest sellers. When we turned them into CDs, I again insisted that we put the 7 inches and compilation tracks and things on, add them on for bonus tracks. I realized a few years later 2 things. One, that as much as people love a band like Operation Ivy or Green Day, most people don't want to listen to 20 songs in a row, even by their favorite band. There's a reason that albums have 10 or 12 songs or 14 songs. And, from a purely commercial standpoint, those extra tracks that we tacked on to the Green Day CD or the Operation Ivy CD. Once those bands became popular, we could have made another LP of each of those and probably sold 1 million of each of those. And it would probably have been a better record in terms of, the attention span of the listener. Then people would have 2 Operation Ivy albums and they would probably love both of them.
Yeah.
But that was that was when one of the many times I shouldn't have listened to the punks. But at the same time, without the punks and without a lot of the DIY punk philosophy, none of this would have happened in the first place. So you win some, you lose some. I never would have dreamed that it would have been possible for me to start my own label and reach millions of people if it hadn't been for the punk way of doing things. So, in some ways it had a happy ending, and what's another 1 million or 2 million records sold anyway in the long run. I mean, luckily both bands did all right even without it, and we did all right too, at least for a while.
I was trying to reread your book before we had the interview, and I didn't make it all the way through again. But I got to this point where it started talking about. I think you'd moved to the new building, and you're like, well, I guess this has to be kind of I can't remember how Molly put it, like an appropriate thing or an actual label or something like that, as opposed to being in like your bedroom, and you professional. There you go, and. You're saying like, oh, I guess I better make an LLC. And it's kind of like blew my mind because I was like, that's the first thing I did. It's like make an LLC and like trademark my name. Was your name trademarked too? No. We didn't do any of that kind of stuff. And again, it was kind of foolish. It's not so much that you should try to cash in on every possible thing, but the fact that if you don't, somebody else will. Yeah.
Like I mean, we're fortunate that we had a lot of goodwill and we didn't make too many enemies, but people could have messed with us a lot more than they did because we didn't bother with a whole lot of. In fact, we didn't even bother with contracts for the first few years.
Oh, wow.
Until actually, it was actually one of our recording engineers who did a lot of the early stuff, and he had some experience in the bigger music business in addition to his punk music experience. And I was saying, no, I don't believe in contracts. That's not punk. And he's saying, well, for your own sake and the band's sake, you really owe it to them and yourself to do it. And I said, yeah, but it's so corporate. And he said, well, no, really what a contract is that you're just setting down on paper what it is exactly that you expect. And the band in turn is doing the same. They may have a very, very different idea of what a label is supposed to do for them. And you may have a very different idea of how a label is supposed to operate or the band is supposed to operate. It doesn't mean either one is right or wrong. It just means that if you find out a year or two down the road that you totally have different values, then you got a problem. And you're going to have, either somebody suing somebody or somebody walking off in a huff. It's kind of like they say about if you're getting married. It's a good plan to talk with your wife or husband ahead of time and say, to make sure you have similar values. Yeah. Are we going to have a joint checking account or are we going to have separate accounts? Are we going to live in the suburbs or are we going to live in the city? Are we going to have kids or are we not going to have kids? Because if you get married and then find out a couple of years down the road that you have totally opposite views, and one of you cannot possibly live in the suburbs and the other you cannot possibly live in the city. Well, that's kind of the thing that you run into with bands all the time and with labels. A lot of bands, they kind of have this imaginary idea that they saw in a movie somewhere where Mr. Talent Scout comes and signs them up, and next thing you know, a truck shows up in front of their house with millions of dollars, and that's how it's when they don't have to do anything except play the music.
Yeah.
And I suppose some labels probably think something similar.
Yeah.
So Kevin was extremely correct, and I thank him for that. We never made a big elaborate contract, but we had some simple principles that we set down in paper, and some bands didn't like that, and a couple just refused to deal with it. But we didn't deal with a lot of other stuff, like publishing, which is an essential part of the music business, and trademarks and copyrights, as you mentioned. So, well, for instance, the famous Lookout label with the smiling face, my original partner in Lookout, David Hayes, created that. But because it was never trademarked, it ended up getting sold to somebody else who had nothing to do with it. And as far as I know, he never got anything out of that.
Oh, wow.
Which is, he's quite unhappy about it. I don't blame him at all. But I never owned that. Neither he nor I ever owned that trademark to that design, or to most of the other stuff that we did, which was foolish. If a lot of people, especially the punks, will gripe at me and say, "Oh, you're a big sellout guy. You made a bunch of money from your big corporate indie label." And it's true that I did a lot better than I ever expected to, thanks mostly to Green Day and Operation Ivy, and to a lesser, several other bands did really well also. But if I were to sit here, I could look. It's one of those glass half full and glass half empty. I mentioned it a couple times in the book. If I were to sit down and enumerate all of the ways that I could have made, well, not I, but the label and the artist both could have made a lot more money. You're talking about many, many millions.
Yeah.
The label at one time was probably worth, best estimate, $30 to $50 million, and we didn't collect any of that. It was basically evaporated. I based that on. Are you familiar with? I'm sure the label Sub Pop.
Yeah.
They were a similar sized label to us, and they had one very famous record in their catalog, which was the first Nirvana record. We had 3 very famous records in ours, and we were about the same size as them. But they were sold for, I don't know, I've heard a lot of versions, but somewhere in the $30 to $50 million range. Yeah. And I think that might have only been for half of it. So, well, we didn't collect any of that. Eventually it became worthless. So there you go.
Like you'd mentioned,
you win some, you lose some.
You had mentioned bands kind of not, well, we were just talking about contracts being kind of like a bad thing kind of for them. And you'd mentioned in the book, like bands not having a very good split of the royalties between other members of the band. I know that even U2, I'm sure that not all of the members contribute as much as all of them, but like the royalties are equal. Did you ever have like talks with the bands to try to convince them to be like, hey, to be a little bit more even-handed?
I had talks with the bands all the time, at least the ones that were willing to talk. Most of them were. Most of them actually like to ask me questions and ask for advice, especially since quite a few of them were very young and very inexperienced. There were some, though, that just wanted to do it their own way, and it didn't matter what my opinion was. And so eventually I just kept it to myself. However, that the issue you bring up is one that was dealt with in all of our standard contracts once we started having them. And the deal was, I wrote it myself, was that either the band had to tell me who got what out of the band's share of the money, or automatically we would pay it equally to each member of the band. I think that's fair. Like, for instance, Green Day, even though the labor is not probably split completely equally in terms of songwriting and stuff, they always split theirs 3 ways. Operation Ivy also did. A couple of other bands had a very elaborate breakdown, like this guy gets 10%, this guy gets 20, I get 50, that kind of thing. And that's their business. And if the people want to play in the band and under those terms, and they all agree on it, and if they did that, they all had to sign an agreement saying this is how we want it, then that's fine. There is a possible problem with we'll split it 3 ways or 4 ways, because what happens if or when the band membership changes?
Yeah.
Now with Green Day, it was simple. Their first record would Look Out. They had 3 members. Then they changed drummers for the second record. So it was split 3 ways between who played on each record. Mm-hmm. Operation Ivy, they kept, basically Operation Ivy sold all of their records after they broke up. So that was no big issue either. But as far as as long as I was there, they always split it 4 ways. But that was just one of several things that I would always, I felt that it was because of being a somewhat older person who had a little bit more experience. I felt that was part of my job as a record label dude to try to look out for that's where part of where the name came from, to look out for the band's interests, because a lot of times they would not. They would just not think of it. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of times I would say, hey guys, maybe you should think about how you want to handle your business affairs in the future if the band gets any bigger. And they say, oh man, we don't want to think about business. We just want to play our music. Even Operation Ivy told me that at one time. And
so they weren't big into having band agreements?
They had a band agreement to split everything each way. And they had an agreement that whatever they did, they all had to agree on, like whether they were going to do a record or what was going to be on it, or that was all settled within band meetings. Mm. And that they were one of the bands that didn't matter what I said. I would say, so hey, Operation Ivy, you ready to do this? And they'd say, no, we had a band meeting, we're going to do this. And that was that. There was no sense arguing about it. Mm. But they were smart guys and very talented guys. It might have meant why they broke up when they did, though, too, because they were so rigid about having this consensus as opposed to let's vote on it or anything. It was more like we all have to agree on everything. So when they ran into a problem, I guess we have to break up.
Yeah.
And, but I was thinking of a number of other bands, though, that I think, I don't think I want to name names, but certain bands were kind of like, they just did not want to deal with the business end of things at all, other than that they would call up, oh, we're out of money. Do we have any money coming? And I don't mean they were like trying to hustle us. It was just like they knew that they got paid every 3 months. And every 3 months we would give them a statement of how many they'd sold and how much they had coming. So I'd get a call in between, like from a band, and they like, oh yeah, well, we're out of money. Are we going to get any money next time? And sometimes, of course, we would say, oh yeah, I got your statement right here. You got like $10,000 coming, and could we get an advance on that? And usually we were able to do that. But I would often say to bands like that, look, you gotta, start thinking of things in, a more practical way to make plans. Things are not probably always going to work the same way they are now. How are you going to, do it in the future? And a lot of times they would just not want to cope with it. So I would often try to create structures and organizations for them, which sometimes worked and sometimes didn't. There were certain bands where members developed a drug problem, and all of the money suddenly went there, and then the other members would be like, wait, where's our money? Oh, sorry, it went up somebody's nose.
Yeah.
What can I do about that?
Hmm.
And, you guys have to figure out a structure for how to deal within the band with that. I cannot come and babysit all of your members to make sure that, that's one of the reasons that I wanted to, unless I got specific advice to the contrary, that's why I wanted to split the money equally among each member.
Yeah.
I would say to them also, have a band fund. If your van breaks down, you need new amps, whatever, you got to have some money set aside rather than just, oh my God, what are we going to do now? Mm-hmm. We're going to have to cancel our gigs because we don't have any money and everything's broken.
In the later years, was that stuff kind of just written for them? Like, sure, here you go kind of deal when you guys did have quite a bit coming in?
It was quite common when things started getting really big for us to advance money to certain bands, especially ones that were very active, like the bands that were touring all the time, they would run up bills and be out on the road, and there would be expenses. And we would know that plenty of money was going to be coming in soon to cover it, because our distributor, More Damn Records, was, perfect, flawless. They never missed a payment. In fact, they would sometimes advance us money too ahead of time.
Mm.
And so, it wasn't really that big of a problem to advance money to bands, especially, most labels, I think, pay only every 6 months. We did every 3 months. And More Damn paid us every month. So we knew months ahead of time what money would be coming in. The situation I didn't want to get into was with a band that kept running up more and more bills, again, usually because somebody had a personal problem, and have them endlessly be in debt, because that not only is it a bad way to run a relationship, but strangely enough, they end up resenting you, even though you're helping them. They kind of get bitter, like, we never get our bill paid off. We always owe you money. So usually we would never advance money more than one payment period at a time.
Mm. Are you still, probably with the exception of maybe one or so people, are you still pretty good friends with a lot of the people that were in the scene that are still around?
Well, it's hard to say, and that's I try to write about that a bit in my book too. It's hard to, not always easy to say, where the friend part leaves off and the business relationship begins. And it was one of the things that really stressed me out about the label towards the end. Is when it started, I was either friends or acquaintances with pretty much everybody that had anything to do with the label. We were mostly all people that just hung out together in the same club and in the same scene. And it was never, nobody ever expected to make any money out of it. And it was several years before it started to become obvious that certain people were only interested in being on the label because they thought they could sell records and make money.
Mm-hmm.
I try to avoid those kind of relationships altogether. A lot of times, starting in the early 90s, people would say, put out our record. We sound just like Green Day, and we could sell a million records easy. And, right away, no, I'm not interested. We already have a Green Day, and I'm interested in bands that are part of our scene that want to do the kind of things that we're doing. But some of the relationships did change. People that were friends to begin with, or kind of that I met with the idea of, hey, I'd like to do a record with you, but I didn't know you before, but I got along with them really well, so we became friends. But at the same time, we also became business partners. Mm-hmm. That's kind of hard to quantify or qualify. You don't always know, and people change too. I'm not saying just other people. I change too. Things that I might have been willing to put up with at one time, I would want to put up with later, and vice versa. I know it's a long answer to a short question, but another aspect of it is that, as I mentioned a second ago, I wanted to think of us as being business partners, not being the label up here and the artist down here, or even basically, I wanted a relationship in which if one side did well, the other side did well. We're putting out a record. The old-fashioned way of looking at it is like, we're going to get this big company to spend a lot of money on us and make us famous. They're trying. The band is trying to get something out of the label. From the start, the model I had was we're two different people or entities, but we have a common interest, and we're going to do this together. And if the band does well, the label does well. If the label does well, the band does well. And so we're not like trying to get something out of each other. We're trying to help each other do well. And for the most part, that worked. But when I started really hating the business side of it was when I started seeing that to a certain number of people, I was just the guy that had control over the money that they wanted, and that they didn't care if their demands hurt the label. Mm-hmm. They just wanted what they wanted for themselves. And if the label went broke, well, so what? They got what they wanted. This was not, what I had bargained for. This is not what I wanted. Mm. That's probably the kind of relationship that a lot of bands have with major labels, because in those cases, they can say, oh, well, if we get a couple million out of Warner Brothers, so what? Even if we flop, Warner Brothers isn't going to go broke. Mm-hmm. If somebody got a couple million out of us and flop, we don't exist anymore. And yet I was starting to run into that attitude with at least a couple of our artists, and it was very discouraging. So in answer to your long ago asked question, I get along well with almost everybody that I'm still in touch with, but I'm not in touch with everybody a lot. A lot of things have changed. People have moved all over the country and all over the world, and some have died. A few have moved on into sort of different scenes or different styles of music where I'm just not likely to run into them. But of those who were the heart and core of the music scene in the early days of Gilman and the early days of Lookout, it's almost always good to see them or hear from them, whether in person or on the internet, or occasionally, like a couple of years ago, they did a Lookout reunion at Gilman where they got together a lot of the old bands that hadn't played together in 20 years or more. And, that was pretty awesome. You got to see a bunch of people, and it's like really astounding. Like some of the bands were just as good as ever or better, even if they hadn't played since 1990.
Mm-hmm. I think I saw some of that. Wasn't that on someone put some of that on YouTube?
I believe most of it's on there somewhere. Mm.
That's kind of cool because I haven't, I have kids now, and I went to college, and so obviously all this stuff afterwards. So me going out to shows is not as often as what it was, but I think I remember seeing the Mr. T Experience probably in 2003 ish or something. That was the last time I think I saw them.
They are still active, one of the few, although it's only the one original member, as is often the case with some of these old time bands.
Mm-hmm. Very cool. What's kind of weird is like you take like the DIY ethic of that, of what you were just talking about, and at the same time, it's not just from like punkish culture that I hear this from. It's from everywhere, that like music doesn't have, you shouldn't be able to make $1 million off your music. You should just barely basically be barely either making a living or giving it away for free. But it seemed to me like the people kind of that you were talking about in the book, or people that you would run into, might have that kind of ideal in what they were saying, but then be coming at you on the other side being like, why aren't you kind of supporting me, or putting me on the label or whatever, kind of like an expectation of getting
I did get that, especially when some of our bands from Gilman started having some success. I would have other bands from the area who played at Gilman coming to me, well, why aren't we on your label? Should we be on your label? And and sometimes it would just be an intangible thing. No, you're not my style of music. You don't represent what I want on Lookout. Luckily, a couple of years later, Fat came along and took a bunch of those guys and did very well with them, because that was where they fit.
Yeah.
But in 1988 or so, I did not know where they fit. I just knew they didn't fit on Lookout. Mm-hmm. You might have heard of a band called No Use for a Name. They were desperate to get on Lookout, and something wasn't right. And they went into Fat when Fat started a couple of years later, and sold a ton of records, probably more than they ever would have sold on Lookout. Mm. So there was that. It was part of the reason that I wanted to go away from it. But I think I might have lost the track of what question exactly you were
Oh
asking.
no, I think I was just asking, like, basically, I'm probably making a statement. Like, if it's fun.
Oh,
It's
I
kind of
know, I
funny,
know.
like, these people over here are like, oh, money, and art shouldn't be mixed together, but then they come kind of towards you when.
I get what you're saying. Yeah, no, there's a couple aspects of that I would want to mention. And one is that a lot of these people who were in the earlier bands, you're talking about teenagers and very early 20 somethings, a lot of whom were still living with their parents or living in punk houses for practically nothing. And your attitude towards money, as I'm sure you will have found as you grew up and got a family and everything, it necessarily has to change unless maybe you're inherited a bunch of money or something. If you got to take care of yourself, you're going to have a slightly different attitude once you got a kid, for example, than you had when you were sleeping on the floor of a bunk house. And so that's just normal. And that's one of the reasons that I was always trying to convince the bands to be at least a little bit more businesslike in their planning. They would say, "Oh, we don't need your money. We just want to play music." But and I'd say, "Yes, but you won't always be that way." And another aspect to consider is that, and it's kind of a downside of the music business because it tends to be that either you make a lot of money or almost none at all. And that's probably not an ideal way of doing things. I mean, I don't begrudge anybody that if somebody sells 10 million records and becomes very rich as a result of that, well, good for them. They don't, they did the work. They probably, what you don't see usually when you see a band that comes out of nowhere and sells 10 million records is the 5 or 10 or 20 years that they put in before that, learning to play and practicing and playing. For Offspring are a good example. I mentioned them in my book. They were they've been playing for 12 years, I think, already before this, and they were still playing to tiny crowds of 10 or 20 people at Gilman just the year before they had their big hit. And all of a sudden they were multimillionaires. But it was not. I mean, I was amazed that they hadn't given up long before, and that they stuck it out. So you can't begrudge somebody becoming really rich if they did the work and they make a product, a song, a record that people want. At the same time, though, and this is probably the more political, economic side of it, I would like to see a world where maybe the biggest bands made a little bit less. Still, it could still be rich, even very rich, but where the regular average bands made at least a decent wage, enough. At least that was at least as good if they were working at a regular menial job, maybe not a high class or professional job, but at least enough to live on. That, but even that gets tricky because I think you and I both know not all bands are particularly good. There's a lot of good bands that don't get as much attention and credit as they deserve, but there are a lot of bands that, while the people in them are maybe having fun and their friends may enjoy listening to it, most people don't want to hear them. It's just the sad case. Neither of my bands has ever become popular, and as a result, I don't feel like I'm entitled to make a bunch of money from being in either of the two bands I was in. I would love it to become very popular and have everybody say, "Oh, I love your band," and buy all my records. But that has not happened, and I don't feel like I'm entitled to it just because I spent a lot of years playing music and stuff. Well, not everybody's music is popular. Not everybody's paintings or everybody's books are popular. That's just the way it is. So I do run into a certain number of musicians who I've been playing music all my life and I deserve to make a living from it. Well, I don't know if that's true or not. It's like if you paint houses for a living and nobody likes the way you paint. Are you entitled to make, no matter how long you've been painting, are you entitled to make a good living from it or not?
You had mentioned on, I think on one of your blogs, I could be wrong, about the Potato Man and the Lookouts making kind of a bit of a comeback a little bit through online streaming. What's your take on Spotify and streaming? I know we talked about 7 inches earlier, 12 inches, and then CDs. Streaming, I mean, it's been around for a little bit, but that's the new kind of way. How do you feel about that?
Well, and this is where I get into territory where I don't have enough expertise. I know I know Joe over at Don Giovanni is written and spoken out quite a bit against organizations like Spotify.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also aware that although they pay royalties, they pay very, very small royalties. But I'm not in a position to know how fair or unfair that is. What the only thing I really do know, or at least think I know, is that that's the technology that we're dealing with today, and whether people like it or not, they're going to kind of have to find a way to navigate it. And obviously, some people are doing so. I don't see, maybe I just don't have enough imagination or enough technical knowledge, but I don't see a way that somebody is going to subvert that whole structure and take us back in a time machine to where everything was physical products. Mm-hmm. Maybe I'm wrong. I could be. But I know, even just speaking for myself, and this might be because I'm older now and I don't really want to accumulate a bunch of things. I'm more interested in, emptying my house out of things, because I just, might sound a bit morbid, but I had to empty the house out from a couple of relatives when they died, and it was like a nightmare. It was like 30, 40 years of stuff that they just couldn't throw away.
Yeah.
And it was because it was all precious. So I had to take it all to the dumpster myself. And, not the worst thing in the world, but depressing and sad.
Yeah.
So I don't want to collect a bunch of records and CDs anymore. I'm happy to listen to music online or on the internet or MP3s, whatever is easy for me. That that might sound selfish, but I think that probably reflects the attitude of most people who like music. Mm-hmm. And they don't need a record or a CD to sit and look at and study. I mean, some people will, but I think they're a small minority. Most people just want to be able to snap their fingers or touch a button and music comes out. Mm-hmm. It's not the worst thing in the world. Whereas, people who make records for a living might say, but we won't make any money if you don't buy physical products. And that's also true. I don't have an answer for them. And I would say probably what they need to do is to figure out something, a different approach. Mm-hmm.
That's actually
around the time I left Lookout, and I was kind of trying to give some advice to the people who were taking over after I left. And I don't know, this might sound weird or cynical or something, but I said, I have a feeling the way things are going in the music business that in a few years, you're not going to be able to make that much money out of records or CDs anymore. And that probably a huge amount of the money is going to, a larger amount is going to come from merchandising, mm-hmm. like from T-shirts or other stuff. I mean, I had only a very simplistic view of it, but I think nowadays I would call that branding, and that what the successful company eventually would be doing would be selling a whole package, with videos, T-shirts, shoelaces, whatever, and and maybe, like I say, maybe it sounds cynical, but you have to deal with the world as it is, not as how you wish it were.
Yeah. Oh, it's back again. Gosh dang. Sorry about that. I only have like 1.5 more questions.
Well, I was talking about the whole 360 deal.
Yes.
Which, like I asked you, I obviously do, and those are, people speak out almost violently against that idea. I don't think it's necessarily such a bad idea. It harkens back to, I say, when I was working with bands in the early days, that a lot of them just did not want to deal with the day-to-day business stuff and all. And at least in some cases, I think if their record label was looking out for them instead, they could concentrate more on their music. And that, to me, is what a good 360 deal would look like. Nowadays, if you want to make money from your music, you're going to have to get it heard in other ways. And for a while, they were saying, "Oh, now bands are going to have to make all their money from concerts and personal appearances the way they used to in the old days," which was true, even though they never made any money. The idea of making a lot of money from recordings is really a very brief period, from about the mid 1960s up until the early 2000s. That is like a brief golden age for people being able to make a lot of money from recordings. But people got used to it and said, "Oh, that's how it's supposed to be. It's always going to be that way." Well, it was never like that before. When I was a kid, it wasn't like that, and it's not anymore. But the idea of saying, so now you got to do it the old-fashioned way and get out and play a lot of shows, well, that works for some, but not everybody could be on the road all the time. I'm thinking of one of my favorite performers of all time, Hank Williams Sr., who back in the 1940s basically lived on the road, going from town to town with his country band. And basically they were so poor they had to ride in a station wagon with all their equipment up on the roof, except when it started raining, they'd have to bring it into the car and sit it on their laps. And they had to drive all night because they couldn't afford hotels. And at least according to some, Hank having to sit with an amplifier on his lap on these 12-hour drives gave him back trouble that in turn led to a painkiller addiction that ultimately killed him. And not everybody's Hank Williams, not everybody tours like that, but not everybody can make a living touring. I think probably in the future, a lot of the money for bands is going to come from having their music feature in movies and TV shows and in other settings. And at one time, I would have been a lot more against that, especially, and I'm still not too thrilled about bands' music being used in commercials, but I'm not 100% against it as I once was. Now it only bothers me if it's a commercial for something that I find offensive or just destructive.
Yeah.
But if there's a product that the band likes and sincerely believes in, why not put their music in the ad? But those are the kind of things that a 360 deal could handle, and that most bands by themselves are not equipped to handle. Mm-hmm. Maybe they can get a manager who's going to take 15% or more of it all, and that he can do that or she can do that. But that's, again, luck of the draw. Most, not just any manager could manage that. So I think that's one possible direction that the music industry is going. Who knows when or if there'll be any touring of any kind again. So probably going to be seeing more virtual performances and online performances.
Yeah. At the beginning of this year, I kind of had a plan when I wanted to start this label, to have it more based on content than just releasing music. Because like you've been talking, there's a myriad of people that, have day jobs and just put out some records and whatnot. And I don't feel like those necessarily support the bands. And because they're not 100% behind them all the time. They're just, helping them put out an album. And being a recording engineer and a producer, I've got that angle down. And I wanted to start moving it to like a lot more content, a lot more video based, a lot more social media based, and get a kind of a plan going on there to kind of reach their fans through that. And it's sad to see the bands, kind of the amount of bands and whatnot, shrink over the last 10 years or so, when we still have, some pop stars and artists it's a lot easier when it's only one person. So I wanted to see if there was a way to make, like we have YouTube channels and whatnot of, people having a fun time, doing fun things, and kind of having a band, having that as kind of like their main focus. And so it's kind of funny because at the beginning of the year, I was like, oh, this is a novel idea. And then like, start going into the COVID, and then like bands are like, we can't do any touring anymore. It almost forces them into the stuff I've kind of been talking about for the last couple years.
Yeah, well, you learn to deal with what you're handed by life and the universe, and if you don't, somebody else will do it instead.
Mm.
One thing I've observed also is that people's attention span continues to shrink.
Yes.
I mean, it was traditionally you didn't do songs longer than 3 minutes, although my band has been guilty of it many times doing longer ones, and they didn't get there. No matter how good they were, they didn't get popular, and people would say, "Oh, that's really long." But many of the greatest rock and roll songs and soul songs, R&B songs of all time are, 2 minutes,
Mm-hmm.
2.5 at most, sometimes even less than 2 minutes. Nowadays, I think, you're looking more and more at like a TikTok video of like 15 seconds.
Oh yeah.
And that doesn't mean that you only do 15-second bits. It means that a huge amount of your audience, so that's about how long they're going to look at it. And then a certain percentage of them are going to say, oh, those kids look like they're having fun and it sounds cool. I'll check them out.
Mm-hmm.
Listen to something a little bit longer, or look at a video that's a little bit longer. But I think anybody who doesn't make that adjustment is probably going to have a problem,
Mm-hmm.
because there is so much media available now. It's like unimaginable. I grew up in a time, well, actually, I'm old enough to remember when my family didn't even have a television. But once we got one, we had 3 channels, and they went off at midnight. So that was your whole choice of media. And then we had a daily newspaper that came every day. That was it. And now somebody could sit in a chair in their living room and never sleep and never eat and never leave that chair, and have non-stop media of all kinds presented to them, and never see the same thing twice.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to get somebody's attention and keep it, you're going to have to be innovative and use some imagination. Probably more than I possess.
I think that for a long time, bands have kind of ignored that. Like they've kind of like sat in that lane of like, oh, we're just going to do records. We're just going to release this way. We're only going to tour. And it's like they haven't taken advantage of all this stuff. And you have people that are, have blown up on TikTok, not necessarily making TikToks themselves, but their music will get put into them and kids dance or do whatever else or whatever. And that artist has blown up because, their music was introduced to a giant group of people through TikTok. And there were no one.
Exactly. It's what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. I don't know how familiar you are with K-pop, but that's like kind of dwarfing much of what was the big thing a few years ago. I mean, even though it's from another country with a whole different culture, I mean, I would say they're probably even bigger in America than most American bands now. And I saw that came out, would seem like it came out of nowhere, but a few years ago I was in Korea, and there was some performers on the street just basically doing the whole K-pop boy band kind of thing, and they were good. I mean, some of them were singing, some were lip syncing, and they were doing these amazing dance things out on the street. They had hundreds of people all just flocking around them, and it was a cold November night. And it didn't matter. I mean, I had not seen that kind of energy at a rock show in years.
Yeah.
And it was also one thing I also think is very crucial. It was at least half or more women in the audience. If you see an audience that's like going crazy, but it's all guys or only a handful of women, and it's just like all the guys being guys, mm-hmm. It's probably not going to get that big. Maybe 10, 20 years ago, yeah, you would have but not anymore. I mean, it's kind of like boys' night out. It's kind of,
Yeah.
they're gonna listen to their favorite metal band and beat the hell out of each other. But that's a dying culture and dying art form.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the audience is going to be like 40 or 50 years old now.
Yeah. No, I totally 100% agree with all of what you said today. So like, and most of what you say in your book, man, I love going through that, and kind of like my main idea, since I'm coming at it from a kind of very different view of what a record label is probably going to be in the future. I just really want to know more about relationships, because what was kind of golden about the punk era in the 90s was that there was a kind of a sense of community about it, and about around the labels even, like, and I want to see how you could create that again, because that was really important to me growing up.
Well, we can always learn more about relationships. And in fact, if we don't, they're probably going to suck after a while, even if they started out great. That's probably the biggest learning experience that I had out of the whole affair, was that I probably needed to pay more attention to relationships with people in general and with myself, because I was the weak link. If I'm not getting along, if I'm not getting along with myself, then I'm not going to be a good partner or business or otherwise with other people. And that was kind of what happened when things started getting stressful. I reacted by becoming cynical and bitter and isolating myself from people, instead of doing the opposite, which would be like, what is bothering me? What can I do to change it? And to make sure that I continue to get along with people better. That's, a lot of that is personal. But the thing is, and I'm sure you would probably agree, I guess you said you have a family.
Yep.
Yeah. Within your family, it's probably very similar, that from day to day, the needs of the various people in your family and the personalities will undergo some change. When you fall in love with somebody, you're falling in love with partly a person, but also partly an ideal of who you think or expect that person to be. And you're going to find out, A, that they're not quite exactly the same that you thought they were, and B, that as time goes by, they're going to change.
Mm-hmm.
And if you focus on that and say, "Oh, why are you changing? You're not the person I fell in love with," you're going to forget that you're not the person you were either. You're going to not notice that you're changing also. And that will be even probably more true, for instance, with children who change dramatically from 1 month to the next when they're young.
Yeah.
So it's you kind of got to check it all the time and be aware of it. And, obviously the relationship between a band and a label is not as intimate as that of a family, but it's not completely different. Just like I've said many times, being in a band with people is like being married to several people at once, and it's hard enough to keep a single marriage between two people fresh and going along smoothly. Imagine 3, 4, 5 people.
Yeah.
You all have to get along and respect each other's needs and values without giving up too much of your own. Real delicate balancing act. Similarly, if you want the label and the band to get along, you've got to recognize that the band who were 18 or 20 years old when they signed and put out their first 7-inch are not the same people who have sold a few million records and now have families and extended families of their own, and business empires to concern themselves with.
Mm-hmm. Definitely true, man. Well, thank you so much for coming on and listening. I do have one last question. What is your favorite release that you've ever done?
That's a silly. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be disparaging. It's a little bit silly. It's how many children do you have?
3.
Which one is your favorite?
Exactly.
However, there are a couple that I'm I've written and said many times I'm particularly proud of, and they're ones that are not popular, not super popular. They are the Brent's TV 7-inch, which probably only sold 1,500 or 2,000, one of our lowest sellers of all, and the Nuisance album, which did a little bit better, but should have been massive. It should have been as big as Nirvana, but wasn't for a variety of reasons. Both of those I especially treasure because they wouldn't have been heard if it weren't for Lookout, but maybe even more so because they represent a certain time and place and culture that was just a homegrown culture up in the north coast of California. That it just was unique and did its own thing and produced its own style of music and its own slang and its own value. And it's almost completely gone now. It just came and went in a brief time. But to me, that was one of the most valuable things about doing a label or doing anything in media is, it's kind of being a historian and saying, here was this amazing thing that happened. And you get to be part of it, even though we were born 20, 50, 100 years later on the other side of the planet. But here's what some people were doing, and maybe you can relate to it and be inspired to do something equally amazing wherever and whenever you are.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, I love the internet for that fact, just because, in the 90s, we just had to kind of wonder like what happened between certain band members or whatever else between, first Green Day's album that I had. And second, you're like, wait a minute, what happened to Al, or what happened to John? Like, what's going on? Like, and I didn't have to wait until I found it in a magazine, maybe 2 or 3 years later, I was reading through, oh, there's an actual interview with him. So it's kind of crazy that we can see documentaries and things. I just watched the Turn It Up documentary the other day, and it's kind of nice to be able to like relive that and see even more than what you saw then. So I thank you so much for being on. Is there anything that you're up to right now that you'd like to plug? I know you got the blog.
Well, I haven't been keeping up with my blog lately. I feel bad about that because a friend recently helped me upgrade it and get it running more smoothly. But most of my time lately has been going into writing my next book, which is about halfway done, at least through the first draft.
Nice.
And of course, we just re-released all of the Potato Man discography on Don Giovanni in digital form only. Mm-hmm. But in the course of doing it, I found a bunch of tracks that I had kind of forgotten about or didn't realize were ready to release. So a bunch of stuff. I don't know if it will reach an audience or not, but it's there. It was very frustrating for quite a few years in the digital age, like on Spotify and all those kind of platforms. There were no Potato Men at all. I was sure that there was at least some people that would like to hear it. Yeah. So I'm happy about that. But the book is taking prominence right now. Oh, and studying Chinese. That's my other big thing. Well, studying languages in general, but Chinese is the main focus. Mm-hmm. I've been on it for a few years now. Yeah. Finally getting to the point where I can watch a Chinese TV show and make some sense of it. Not a lot, but some. Yeah. for whenever I get back to China, I hope, well, assuming that it ever happens, I hope to be able to have many rewarding conversations. Mm-hmm. It's like entering into a whole different world, a whole different universe almost, because in order to speak another language, especially one that's very different from our own, we need to think in a different language and have a whole different philosophical outlook, which is kind of like, when I was young, when they first traveled into outer space, up until that time, it was only science fiction, the idea that people could go up in space and go from one planet to another and that. And this will sound weird maybe, but, we were always taught in school, the world doesn't look like it, but the world is round. But you could, looking around, you say, oh, it looks flat to me. But I know all the teachers and everything said it's round, so it must be. But until the first rocket ship went out into space and took a picture and of the planet of the planet Earth. Yeah, wow, that's us. We really are round. And it took on a whole different meaning, a whole different reality. And this is kind of what it's like, being able to immerse yourself into another frame of thought, another frame of reference, like a different language. You get a sense of perspective. That you not only understand that culture a little bit more, you understand your own culture a little bit more because you can see it from the outside looking in as well as the inside looking out. So extremely rewarding for me. I wish I had spent more of my younger life studying languages.
Very, very cool. Well, thanks so much for coming on despite all the technical difficulties, whatever. It's been awesome, and I really appreciate it.
I appreciate you taking the time to talk with me. Always glad to have a chance to sound off about my ideas, some of them hopefully useful and others maybe not so much, but there they are.
Awesome. Well, thanks, man. You have yourself a good night.
Thank you, and you too. I'll look forward to seeing where your enterprise goes from here, and as the world changes, and as you do, I may be able to brag to people that I talked to you back when you were just getting started out.
Well, thanks, man. Talk to you later.
All right, bye bye now.